This is the second section called So What, looking at our Vanguard lecture series. What we know is that groups working individually or professions working individually helps, but does not help enough. And that what we really need in Canada is a coordinated approach. And that means that a number of different actors will have to be engaged in this area. And I note from our registration of our class that we have folks from a broad spectrum of backgrounds. So that brings together a great hope that there's a great understanding about our need for a multi-actor levels. I'm going to talk a little bit about this report and this initiative, which was started in British Columbia a number of years back. And this is speaking to the bullet of the first stage of the Common Understanding. In British Columbia, there's something that existed called the BC Adult Abuse and Neglect Prevention Collaborative. And it's a group of people who essentially headed up agencies, organizations, and government ministries who looked around issues of adult abuse and neglect. And in a strategic planning session, these volunteers who acted together as a group indicated that looking at the intersection of social vulnerability and capacity was the number one concern. And in that strategic planning session, it was particularly indicated that there was no clarity around what language meant, what responses were appropriate, and such. And so that group got together and with a generous grant from the Law Foundation of British Columbia, did foundational work bringing together a coordinated approach, a common understanding, a common lexicon for which services and responses across the spectrum in British Columbia would come together. So the goal was, if someone had a concern about adult abuse and neglect with regards to capacity or vulnerability, if they called the EMS workers, the nurse, the doctor, the police, Crime Stoppers, the Crown Justice System, or other systems who might be engaged, we would all be working from the same playbook. And it's been a big success, and this model has been looked at across the country and now around the world. So that's the reason why I'm putting forward the Vanguard approach to you today. And you'll see in the report that you've read much more information about it. The Vanguard approach looked at the concept of what is capability or capacity. And it was very clear that it was about decision making. And so we predominantly reject the notion that you are what we call plenary incapable, which means across the board. So very few people have no ability to make decisions whatsoever or express any form of preference. Unless you are literally in a coma, then of course you have a plenary incapacity. But there's this idea that decision making is something that you can do in slices. And the decision making and the capacity to make those decisions is always understood within a context. And what that means is that the individual, where how they are located with their colleagues, friends, family, resources, social connections, and housing, plays a significant role within a person's ability to make decisions. You may, at some point in your life, have found yourself with not enough money, out on the street, incapable due to drugs and alcohol, etc. And you will then find that your capacity or your vulnerability is increased or decreased accordingly. And so it's on that basis that we look at the question of capacity. So the next slide gives you a very simple definition of what is capacity or what is capability. And really, across the country, the legal test is the same. A capable person is able to understand information, evaluate data, and appreciate the consequences of what that means. And so if a person, for instance, is able to be given a lot of information, perhaps about a psychiatric condition, can you tell me about schizophrenia? And the person is able to completely explain what the DSM-4 says about schizophrenia, but does no understanding that they themselves are schizophrenic, despite the fact that they have had a long and robust set of treatment for it, and indeed are schizophrenic, then they would be able to understand, but not really appreciate. By contrast, my grandmother, when she was in hospital and quite cognitively impaired, was not able to make a decision about a healthcare decision that she needed to do. She needed to have some surgery. She was able to appreciate that something was going to happen to her body, and whether she wanted it or not. She pushed people away, and they came to try to give her needles and such, but she couldn't actually understand what the healthcare needs were, and she couldn't understand the risks and benefits. So she had some form of kind of appreciation that someone's going to do something, but not an understanding about it was. So in order to be capable in law, you must be able to understand the information provided to you, weigh it off, understand risks and benefits, and appreciate the consequences for it. And it's important as well to understand that capability is a continuum. It is not black and white, very, very rarely. That there are degrees of capability and that they can fluctuate, increase, or decrease over time. And that we're always looking at decisions. So when we say, is the person capable, the answer should always be capable of doing what? Moving to the next slide, we look at planning for future decisions. This is a nexus of capability that's often looked at. And in one corner, you see that the adult, and we're not talking about children here because you must have legal capacity. An adult, if the person is in all ways able to make their decision, they're the ones who decide. So you just look downwards. But if you're completely incapable, for instance, in a coma, then someone else is going to decide, a substitute decision maker, which I've indicated by SDM. But the reality is it's very rarely quite so black and white. And when you have a person with a capacity challenge, it's somewhere often on a scale. There is always a presumption that an adult is capable anywhere in the country at all times. And that's something that we really need to bring forward to understand, because when we have ageist ideas and beliefs that inform that, part of the problem is people are assumed to be incapable if they are older, which is always incorrect. You must always assume capacity. So looking to the next slide, you can see it again in a different figure. If you are capable, then you decide. If you are capable, then somebody else decides. The capacity continuum, you can see, goes on an east-west axis. And anyone who's ever had perhaps a glass of wine too much to drink can understand that perhaps they might not be capable of making some decisions or doing some things. Indeed, that's one of the reasons that we look at some of the drunk driving issues. If you're not capable of driving, you may in fact be capable of doing all kinds of things, but not others. It's decisional. At this point, I'm going to move to our next section on vulnerability.